Hello, my name is Matthew, and I want to tell you the story of how I learned English. When I was younger, I didn't know any English at all. I only spoke my native language, which was the language everyone around me used. At home, at school, and in my community, there wasn't much need for English. But even then, I knew that learning English was important. I remember the first time I saw an English movie. I couldn't understand anything, but I loved how the words sounded. It made me curious, and I wanted to know what the actors were saying. I also knew that many people around the world spoke English, and I felt like it would help me connect with others outside my own country. Another reason I wanted to learn English was for my studies. I had heard that a lot of books and resources in different subjects were written in English. I thought, if I can read English, I will have more knowledge. I knew English could open doors to more opportunities, not only for school, but also for my future career. I dreamed of having a job where speaking English would be important, whether that was working with people from different countries, or even traveling abroad one day. At first, the idea of learning English felt a bit scary. I didn't know where to start, and everything seemed so different from my native language, but I was determined. I didn't want to give up before I even began. So, I made a decision. I would take my first step and see where it led me. That was the moment my English learning journey began. When I first decided to learn English, I didn't know where to begin. It seemed like a big challenge because English was so different from my native language. But I was excited, and I knew that every journey starts with small steps. So I started with the basics. I remember sitting down with a simple English book, a dictionary, and a notebook. The first thing I did was learn the alphabet. It may sound funny, but for me, learning how to say and write the letters of the English alphabet was my very first step. I also started learning basic words like hello, thank you, and goodbye. These words seemed easy, but it took me time to understand how to say them correctly. Every time I learned a new word, I would write it down in my notebook. I would look up its meaning and practice saying it out loud. I realized that learning how to pronounce English words was very different from my native language. Some sounds didn't exist in my language, and I struggled with how to move my mouth and tongue to make the right sound. But I didn't give up. One of the most helpful resources for me in the beginning was watching English videos online. I found short videos where people spoke slowly and clearly. I remember watching my first English video, and although I didn't understand everything, I could pick out a few words that I knew. That small success gave me confidence. I realized that even though I couldn't understand much, I was learning. I also discovered English podcasts, which were a great way to practice listening. At first, I didn't understand anything. The speakers talked fast, and it all sounded like a blur of words, but I kept listening, even if I could only pick out one or two words. Over time, I started to recognize more words and phrases, and slowly it became easier. One of my favorite things to do was listen to a podcast while reading the transcript. This way, I could see the words while hearing them, and that helped me connect how the words looked with how they sounded. Reading books was another important part of my learning. I started with simple children's books because the language was easy and the stories were short. Even though the books were for children, they were a perfect way for me to practice. The sentences were simple, and the words were ones I could use in daily life. I would read the same book several times until I understood most of the words. In the beginning, one of the biggest challenges I faced was grammar. English grammar seemed so complicated to me, especially because it was so different from the grammar of my native language. I remember trying to figure out why verbs changed forms like go, went, and gone. It was confusing, and I often made mistakes when speaking or writing. I also had trouble with sentence structure. In my native language, we put words in a certain order, but in English, it was different. Sometimes I would translate sentences directly from my language into English, and they didn't make sense at all. This made me feel frustrated, but I kept practicing. I knew that every mistake I made was a chance to learn and get better. Another challenge I faced was finding the time to study. Life was busy with school, family, and other activities, and it wasn't always easy to sit down and focus on English. But I knew that if I wanted to get better, I had to practice every day. So I made a plan. I decided to spend at least 30 minutes each day on English. Some days I would study new words, and other days I would listen to podcasts or watch videos. Even if I was tired or busy, I tried to do something small every day. I realized that even small efforts added up over time. At times, I felt like I wasn't making any progress. There were days when I felt stuck and wondered if I would ever be able to speak or understand English fluently. But I reminded myself that learning a language takes time and patience. I told myself to focus on the small victories, like understanding a new word or finishing a short book. Little by little, I started to see improvement. I could recognize more words in the videos I watched, and I could read simple sentences without needing to look up every word. This progress kept me motivated to keep going, even when it was hard. Looking back, those early steps were the foundation of my English learning journey. They were slow, sometimes frustrating, and full of challenges, but they were also exciting. Every new word, every sentence I could understand was a step forward. I knew I was on the right path, and I felt proud of myself for starting the journey. One of the most important things I learned early on in my English journey was the value of daily practice. At first, I didn't realize just how important it was to practice every day. I thought that studying once or twice a week would be enough. But soon, I discovered that learning a language requires constant effort. The more time I spent with English, the more familiar it became to me, and the faster I improved. That's when I decided to make English a part of my daily routine. I started with small, simple activities. I would begin my day by reading a few pages of an English book. At first, I used children's books or very simple beginner-level texts. The sentences were easy to understand, and the vocabulary was basic, which helped me build my confidence. I found that by reading every morning, I became more comfortable with the language. I didn't worry too much about understanding every word. Instead, I focused on getting the general meaning of the sentences and stories. Over time, I noticed that I was recognizing more and more words without having to use a dictionary. Another key part of my daily routine was watching English videos. I found a lot of English learning channels online where the teachers spoke slowly and clearly. I would watch a video or two every day, trying to follow along as much as possible. Some days, I couldn't understand everything, and I would feel frustrated. But I reminded myself that learning takes time. So I kept watching. Gradually, I found that I could understand more of what the speakers were saying. I even started to pick up on some of the common phrases and expressions they used. Watching these videos also helped me with my listening skills, which was one of the hardest parts of learning English for me. In addition to videos, I listened to podcasts. I would put on an English podcast while doing chores around the house or going for a walk. In the beginning, it was hard to keep up with the fast speech. The words would come at me so quickly that it felt like I wasn't learning anything. But I didn't stop. I knew that listening was a skill, and like any skill, it needed practice. Little by little, my ears started to get used to the rhythm of the English language. I began to recognize familiar words and phrases, and slowly, I was able to follow the conversation better. Listening to podcasts daily was a great way for me to immerse myself in English, even when I didn't have time to sit down and study. One thing I did every day was make a list of new words I had learned. Whether from a book, a video, or a podcast, whenever I came across a new word, I would write it down in my notebook. Then, I would try to use that word in a sentence. Sometimes I would write the sentence, and other times I would try to say it out loud. This helped me remember the words better. I would also review the words at the end of each week to make sure I hadn't forgotten them. Slowly, my vocabulary started to grow. Words that once seemed strange and unfamiliar became a part of my daily language. Speaking was one of the hardest parts of my daily practice, especially because I didn't have many people around me who spoke English. Living in a place where English wasn't commonly spoken made it difficult to find someone to practice with. But I didn't let that stop me. I found ways to practice speaking on my own. I would talk to myself in English, repeating sentences I had learned or describing things around me. For example, if I was walking down the street, I would say things like, "The sky is blue," or "I see a car." It may sound funny, but it really helped me get used to forming sentences in English. I also found that reading aloud was a great way to practice speaking. Every day, I would read a few pages of my English book out loud. At first, I felt a little silly doing it, but it was incredibly helpful. Reading aloud forced me to focus on pronunciation, and it helped me become more comfortable with speaking English. I would try to imitate the way the words were spoken in the videos or podcasts I had listened to. This helped me sound more natural and improved my confidence in speaking. One of the biggest benefits of practicing daily was that I started to see progress. When I first began, I often felt like I wasn't improving. But as I practiced every day, I began to notice small changes. I could read longer sentences without stopping. I could listen to a podcast and understand a few more words each time. I could watch an English video and follow along with the conversation better. These small improvements motivated me to keep going. I realized that learning English wasn't about making big leaps in progress overnight. It was about taking small steps every day. Another thing that helped me stay motivated was setting small, achievable goals. I didn't try to learn too much at once. Instead, I would focus on learning 5 new words a day, or finishing one short story a week. These small goals were easy to reach, and they gave me a sense of accomplishment. Each time I reached a goal, it felt like a victory, and that kept me excited about learning English. Practicing every day also helped me build good habits. English became a natural part of my routine, just like brushing my teeth or eating breakfast. It wasn't something I had to force myself to do. It became something I enjoyed. I looked forward to reading a new chapter in my book or watching the next episode of my favorite English show. Daily practice transformed learning from a difficult task into an enjoyable part of my day. In the end, it was this daily practice that made the biggest difference in my English learning journey. The more I practiced, the more comfortable I became with the language. Every day was a step forward, even on the days when it felt hard. And slowly but surely, I began to see the results of my hard work. Learning English was not easy for me. In fact, there were many times when I felt frustrated and unsure if I would ever be able to speak or understand the language fluently. The more I practiced, the more I realized how complex English could be, especially compared to my native language. But I also knew that overcoming these challenges was part of the process, and each difficulty was a chance to improve. Looking back, there were a few key areas that gave me the most trouble, but overcoming them helped me grow the most. One of the biggest challenges I faced early on was pronunciation. English has many sounds that don't exist in my native language, and I often struggled to make my mouth and tongue move the right way to pronounce words correctly. For example, words with the th sound, like think or that, were incredibly difficult for me. In my language, we don't have that sound, so every time I tried to say these words, it felt awkward and wrong. I would watch videos of people explaining how to pronounce the th sound, and I practiced in front of the mirror, trying to copy the way they moved their mouths. Even after hours of practice, I still found it difficult. Another tricky sound for me was the R sound in English. In my native language, the R sound is pronounced differently, and I kept mixing up the two. I remember feeling embarrassed when I tried to say words like river or right, but they didn't come out the way I wanted them to. This made me nervous about speaking in English, especially when I was around other people who could speak it well. But I didn't let my fear stop me. I kept practicing, repeating words and sentences over and over again until I started to improve. It wasn't a fast process, but little by little, my pronunciation became clearer. The key was patience and not being afraid to make mistakes. Another major challenge was grammar. English grammar is full of rules that are not always easy to understand, especially for someone whose native language has very different rules. One of the first things that confused me was verb tenses. In English, verbs change depending on when something happens, like go, went, and gone. At first, I didn't know when to use each form, and I would often mix them up in my sentences. I might say, I go to the store yesterday, instead of, I went to the store yesterday. It took a lot of practice to understand how verb tenses worked, and even after I understood the rules, I still made mistakes. I also struggled with sentence structure. In my native language, the order of words in a sentence is different from English. Sometimes, I would translate sentences directly from my language into English, but they didn't make sense. For example, I might say, "To the market I go," instead of "I go to the market." This was especially confusing when it came to asking questions in English. In my language, we don't change the order of words to ask a question, but in English, the subject and verb often switch places. So instead of saying, "You are going," I had to remember to say, "Are you going?" It took a lot of time to get used to this new way of forming sentences, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. One of the most frustrating moments for me was when I tried to have a conversation with someone in English, but I couldn't express myself clearly. I remember one time when I met a tourist who was visiting my country. I was excited to practice my English with them, but as soon as I started speaking, I felt nervous. My words came out jumbled, and I couldn't remember the right grammar. I tried to explain something simple, but I kept using the wrong verb tense, and the person didn't understand me. It was embarrassing, and for a moment, I felt like giving up on learning English. But I reminded myself that mistakes are part of the learning process. Every time I made a mistake, it was an opportunity to learn something new. One key moment when I felt like I made real progress was when I was finally able to understand a full conversation in English without needing to translate everything in my head. For the longest time, whenever I listened to someone speak English, I would translate their words into my native language to understand the meaning. This made conversations slow and difficult because I couldn't keep up with the speed of the speaker. But one day, I was listening to a podcast, and I realized that I was understanding what the speaker was saying without needing to translate. It was a small victory, but it felt huge to me. For the first time, English didn't feel like a foreign language. It started to feel more natural, and I could follow along with the conversation more easily. Another breakthrough moment was when I watched my first English movie without subtitles. Before, I always relied on subtitles in my native language to understand what was happening in the movie. But one day, I decided to challenge myself and watch the movie without any subtitles. At first, I was nervous. I thought I wouldn't understand anything. But as the movie went on, I found that I could follow the story. I didn't catch every word, but I understood enough to know what the characters were saying and what was happening in the movie. That moment made me realize how far I had come in my English learning journey. Of course, there were still many challenges after that. English is a complex language, and even after years of learning, there are always new things to discover. But those moments of progress, when I could see the results of my hard work, gave me the motivation to keep going. I learned that challenges are not something to be afraid of. They are opportunities to grow, and each challenge I overcame made me a better English speaker. Looking back, I realized that overcoming these challenges was what made me stronger in my English learning journey. Pronunciation, grammar, and sentence structure were all difficult, but they were also the areas where I saw the most improvement over time. I learned to be patient with myself and to celebrate every small victory. The challenges didn't disappear, but they became easier to handle as I continued to practice. And each time I overcame a new obstacle, I felt more confident and more capable in my ability to learn English. Staying motivated while learning English was not always easy, but I knew that consistency was the key to success. There were days when I felt tired, discouraged, or too busy to practice. but I reminded myself of why I started this journey in the first place. I had set clear goals for myself to improve my communication skills, expand my opportunities, and connect with more people around the world. These goals were my constant source of motivation, especially on days when I felt like giving up. One of the things that kept me motivated was focusing on the small victories. Learning a language is a long journey, and it can be easy to feel overwhelmed by how far you still have to go. But I found that by celebrating the little improvements, I stayed excited about learning. For example, I remember the first time I was able to understand a short conversation in English without having to translate every word in my head. It felt like a huge achievement. These small wins, like understanding a new word or completing a full page in an English book, gave me the confidence to keep going. Another thing that helped me stay motivated was setting small, manageable goals. Instead of trying to master everything at once, I broke down my learning into smaller tasks. I would focus on learning 5 new words a day, or I would set a goal to watch 1 English video every evening. By setting these small goals, I could measure my progress more easily and feel a sense of accomplishment each time I achieved one. Over time, these little goals added up, and I could see real improvement in my English skills. One of the biggest motivators for me was seeing the practical benefits of learning English. The more I practiced, the more I noticed that I was starting to understand things that used to confuse me. For example, I started to understand simple English conversations in movies or on YouTube videos. It wasn't perfect. I still missed some words here and there, but I could follow along with the story and understand the main idea. This gave me a sense of progress, and it felt like all my hard work was starting to pay off. I also started to notice improvements in my speaking ability. In the beginning, speaking English felt like a huge challenge. I was always worried about making mistakes, and I didn't feel confident enough to speak in front of others. But as I practiced speaking every day, whether by reading out loud or talking to myself in English, I slowly became more comfortable. One day, I had a conversation with someone in English, and I realized that I was able to respond without thinking too much about grammar or vocabulary. It felt natural, and for the first time, I wasn't as nervous. I still made mistakes, but I didn't let them stop me. That moment was a huge boost to my confidence. Another key motivator for me was the idea of progress over perfection. I realized that it wasn't about being perfect at English right away. It was about getting a little better every day. When I accepted that mistakes were part of the learning process, I felt more free to try new things. Whether it was trying to use a new word in a sentence or practicing a difficult pronunciation, I reminded myself that every attempt was a step forward, even if I didn't get it right the first time. This mindset shift helped me stay consistent, even when I faced challenges. Having a routine also played a big role in keeping me motivated. I set aside time each day to practice English, whether it was 30 minutes of reading or listening to a podcast while doing chores. By making English a part of my daily life, it became a habit. It wasn't something I had to force myself to do. It became something I looked forward to. I began to see English not as a subject I had to study, but as a tool that I was gradually mastering. In addition to setting goals and building a routine, I also stayed motivated by reminding myself of the bigger picture. Learning English opened up new opportunities for me, whether it was in my career, my travels, or my ability to connect with people from different cultures. This was especially motivating because I knew that being able to speak English would give me access to more information, more experiences, and more connections with people around the world. This sense of purpose made all the hard work feel worthwhile. I also found that tracking my progress helped me stay motivated. I kept a notebook where I would write down new words I learned or grammar rules that I wanted to remember. Looking back at this notebook after a few months, I was amazed at how much I had learned. Words that were once unfamiliar to me were now part of my daily vocabulary. Sentences that I struggled to form in the beginning were now easy for me to say. Being able to see my progress on paper gave me a sense of achievement and motivated me to keep pushing forward. One day, I realized just how far I had come when I was able to hold a conversation with a native English speaker. It wasn't perfect, and there were still some words I didn't know, but I was able to express myself clearly and understand what they were saying. I didn't need to pause and think about every word. I could just speak. This was a huge moment for me because it showed me that all the small steps I had taken were adding up to real progress. I felt more confident than ever, and I knew that I could continue improving as long as I stayed consistent. The journey to learn English was filled with challenges, but by staying motivated and consistent, I was able to overcome those challenges and make real progress. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when I felt stuck or frustrated. But each day that I practiced, I moved a little closer to my goal, and each small improvement, whether it was understanding a new word or speaking more confidently, reminded me that I was capable of learning and growing. Looking back, I realized that the key to my progress was not giving up, even when things got difficult. The small improvements I noticed along the way, understanding more words, feeling more confident speaking, and following conversations without needing to translate, kept me motivated. Each of these milestones showed me that I was getting better, and that motivated me to keep going, one step at a time. As I progressed in my English learning journey, I discovered that using a variety of techniques was essential to improving my skills. Each aspect of the language, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, required different strategies, and focusing on all of them helped me become a more well-rounded English speaker. I tried many different approaches over time, but a few techniques worked particularly well for me, and I believe they can help others too. One of the most effective techniques I used was listening to English as much as possible. In the beginning, it was difficult to understand native speakers because they spoke quickly, and I wasn't familiar with many of the words they used. To improve my listening skills, I started with something simple: watching English videos and listening to podcasts or audiobooks that were designed for beginners. I would listen to the same audio several times, repeating it until I could understand more and more of what was being said. I also made it a habit to listen to English while doing other tasks, like cooking or walking. The constant exposure to the language helped me get used to the sounds and rhythm of English, and over time, I found that I was able to understand more without needing to concentrate as much. Another powerful technique was speaking. At first, I was shy about speaking in English because I was afraid of making mistakes, but I quickly learned that the only way to improve was to practice speaking as much as possible. I started by speaking to myself in English, describing what I was doing, or practicing simple sentences. It felt strange at first, but it was a great way to get comfortable with speaking without the pressure of having an audience. Later on, I found language partners online and started having short conversations with them. Even though I made many mistakes in the beginning, I noticed that the more I spoke, the more natural it became. Speaking English regularly helped me build my confidence, and it also gave me the opportunity to learn new words and phrases from real conversations. Reading was another essential part of my learning process. I started with children's books and simple stories that were written in clear, easy-to-understand English. These books helped me learn new vocabulary and see how sentences were structured. As my reading skills improved, I moved on to more challenging material like news articles and short novels. One of the most effective techniques I used while reading was to write down any new words or phrases I didn't understand. I kept a small notebook where I would write these words, along with their meanings and an example sentence. This helped me remember the new vocabulary, and I would review my notebook regularly to reinforce what I had learned. To improve my writing, I made it a habit to write short paragraphs or journal entries in English every day. At first, I struggled to express my ideas clearly, and I often made grammar mistakes. But just like with speaking, the more I practiced, the easier it became. Writing gave me the chance to think about how to use new words and practice constructing sentences correctly. It also helped me improve my understanding of grammar rules. One technique that worked for me was to write about simple, everyday topics, like what I did during the day or how I felt about something. Writing regularly helped me track my progress, and I could look back at older entries to see how much I had improved over time. Along with these techniques, I found that setting specific goals was a key part of my success. Rather than trying to learn everything at once, I set small, achievable goals for myself, like learning 5 new words each day or reading 1 short story every week. These goals gave me a clear direction and kept me motivated. I also set long-term goals, such as being able to have a 10-minute conversation in English without stopping or watching a movie in English without subtitles. By breaking down my goals into manageable tasks, I was able to stay focused and see progress regularly. Another technique that worked well was practicing new words in real-life situations. Whenever I learned a new word or phrase, I would try to use it in a sentence as soon as possible, whether in conversation or in writing. This helped me remember the word more effectively than just memorizing it from a book. I also made it a point to review new vocabulary regularly. I used flashcards to quiz myself on the meanings of words, and I practiced using them in different contexts to make sure I really understood how to use them correctly. To anyone learning English, I would encourage you to follow these simple habits. First, set clear, achievable goals for yourself. Whether it's learning a certain number of words each week or watching a specific number of English videos, having goals will help you stay motivated and focused. Second, practice every day, even if it's just for a short amount of time. The more consistent you are, the more progress you will see. Third, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are part of the learning process, and each mistake is an opportunity to learn something new. Finally, try to use English in your daily life as much as possible. Whether you're speaking to yourself, writing in a journal, or chatting with a friend online, using the language regularly will help you improve faster than you might expect. By combining these techniques, listening, speaking, reading, writing, setting goals, and practicing new words, I was able to make steady progress in my English learning journey. It wasn't always easy, but by staying consistent and using the right strategies, I gradually improved my skills and gained the confidence I needed to communicate effectively in English. Learning English is truly a journey, one that is filled with ups and downs, challenges, and small victories. It's important to remember that everyone starts from the same place. No one becomes fluent overnight. It takes time, patience, and dedication, but with each step you take, you get closer to your goal. There were times when I felt discouraged, when I thought I wasn't making enough progress, or when I struggled with difficult words or confusing grammar rules. But each of those moments was a part of the learning process. Over time, I realized that the most important thing wasn't how fast I was improving, but that I was improving at all. Every new word I learned, every conversation I had, every mistake I corrected, these were all steps forward. I want to encourage you to keep going, even when the road feels long or difficult. Learning English is a powerful skill that can open many doors for you, whether in your career, your studies, or your ability to connect with people from different cultures. The effort you put in today will pay off in the future. It's okay to take your time, and it's okay to make mistakes. What matters is that you keep moving forward. Remember, it's not about perfection, but about progress. Each day that you practice, you're getting a little better. Whether you're learning new words, listening to English videos, or speaking with a friend, you're building the foundation for fluency. Stay consistent, stay motivated, and celebrate the small achievements along the way. You too can learn English step by step. Just like I did, you will find your own way to improve, and before you know it, you'll be able to communicate with confidence. Believe in yourself, trust the process, and enjoy the journey of learning. With time, dedication, and the right techniques, you'll see amazing progress, and you'll be proud of how far you've come.